Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
Efforts heat up to resolve a looming budget deficit. We talk to the leaders trying to fix the problem. Next in Capitol Report. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Capitol Report. I'm Julie Barkey. The 2010 legislative session is primarily a bonding year, but lawmakers are taking steps now to resolve a looming budget deficit in the next biennium. That multi-billion-dollar problem sparked the creation of the subcommittee on a balanced budget. Members recently met for the first time. Their role is to bridge the recommendations of the Minnesota Leadership Summit held in September to the next phase of planning and action to create a sustainable, balanced budget. John Brune explains more on the challenging task the subcommittee faces.
At the initial meeting, lawmakers, legislative staff, and administration officials reviewed Leadership Summit documents and current Minnesota budget reductions, and also listened to how other states are approaching their budget problems. The Balanced Budget Subcommittee will be charged with setting up an overall framework of the state's budget situation to assist legislative committees.
Representative Carlson and I want to make clear that this group does not intend to do the work of the finance committees or the tax committees.
Subcommittee members heard about long and short-term budget problems. State economist Tom Stinson pointed to some recent changes in important revenue streams that could have a current impact on the state.
When you total all the revenues in 2009, the first quarter, and all the revenues in 2010, the first quarter, what you find is that we actually collected $359 million less, or about 10% less.
State demographer Tom Gillespie recapped some factors and trends that may create future economic problems.
We believe state spending will shift focus from education, infrastructure, and higher education to increasing spending on support of health and human services for an aging population. One dimension of this that's very important is the healthcare dimension. And if we look at healthcare costs by age over the life spectrum, that the age group that we see the largest single jump in annual cost is that 55 to 64-year-old age group, which just happens to be the largest, the most rapidly growing age group over the next decade.
To help understand the impact of those and other factors, legislative staff unveiled a new software program intended to assist in finding a budget solution. That discussion opened the door to more options and ideas for the future.
So I think this is a great tool. I think maybe there should be some consultation, if possible, with nonpartisan tax staff as well, to figure out how could we throw tax expenditures into this interactive tool, as members might want to say, well, there's straight up tax increases, there's straight up cuts, and then there's this hybrid called tax expenditures. It's really the hidden spending that's going on in the Minnesota budget all the time. And most people think, as legislators, bipartisanly, they think about the finance stuff, and they don't think about the tax side. And when you turn off some tax preferences, sacred cows or not, you really do save a lot of money forever.
Minnesota's long-term budget deficit is projected to be $5 to $7 billion. The initial meeting of the Balanced Budget Subcommittee shined a light on the complexities of mapping a strategy to solve the problem. Current economic conditions and future demographic trends are not encouraging, and political differences between the legislature and the governor's administration still remain. However, with more meetings to follow, subcommittee members hope to create a blueprint for a sustainable, balanced budget.
Here to give more details on that subcommittee on balancing the budget, we have Senate Majority Leader Larry Poggemiller. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Good morning. Good to see you.
This subcommittee is also being called the Big Picture Committee. What's your vision for the big picture as you go into this?
Well, that's an interesting name people are calling it now, but the whole idea is we had all these former governors come together, former legislative leaders, and they said, look, this is a reality check. You have to look at the long-term prognosis for the ship of state. And the long-term prognosis is you have a $5 to $7 billion deficit, structural problem between spending and revenue, and you're going to run into an iceberg. And you should try to do something about that. And so the idea for this bipartisan group between the House and the Senate is to start to address that and try to figure out how to take some small steps towards avoiding the iceberg.
As you begin to take these small steps, really to set the scene, In a statement that was used a lot last session, how do you see the mother, father, the family sitting around the kitchen table being impacted by this big picture?
Well, the circumstance is exactly the same as they confront. They sit there, they look at their budget, and they go, you know, one of us just lost our job, and we don't have enough revenue to pay for all of our expenses. So we're going to have to cut back on things we're doing. You know, we'll cut back on a vacation. Maybe you'll go to a public school, not a private school. Whatever these choices are, we won't buy that brand new TV. They're going to have to do that, but they're also going to have to get that second job, because there's no way they can reduce their lifestyle that far that makes sense for their children's future. So there's going to be a combination. That's what these former governors suggested. They said, look, you have to bring down your cost structure, you have to cut spending, but you're also going to have to bring in some new revenue. And so we need to get to work on that, and we need to get job creation in our state, because we're up at 8% unemployment. We need to get more jobs. We need to put people back to work. And we need to bring down our cost structure, particularly in the healthcare area.
And the devil is in the details. So how do you do this? How do you bring in revenue?
Well, it's hard work. It's one thing to say we're just going to cut our expenses 8 or 10%, but you can't. It's harder than that, because when you say you're going to cut state expenses, that means education and healthcare for people. Those are the two largest expenditure items at the state level. 40 to 50% of what we spend is on education. If you include higher ed, it's upwards towards 60% of what we spend. And so the choice we're going to have to make is between somehow reforming the way we spend, get higher productivity, increase some revenue on people who can afford it, and bring down the cost structure and spend less on some areas that we just can't afford to spend on anymore. And those are hard things to do, because some Minnesotan, somebody at that kitchen table, is affected by every one of those decisions, either in terms of increased property taxes, increase of a choice between what school or the quality of school they can go to, or whether they're going to have good police and fire protection. Those are the issues that are at stake here, and we need to balance those issues in a way that we have a shared sacrifice to get a balanced budget and set up a situation where there's some hope for the future in terms of increased productivity and better outcomes for our healthcare and for jobs.
And the argument is that the jobs of the future are going to require more education and more training. So how do you scale back on higher ed? How do you find the dichotomy?
That's the challenge. There are some areas where we're not as productive in education as we need to be. We all know that we have to invest in early childhood education, preparation for young people before they get to kindergarten. And that's an area where Minnesota actually does not lead in the nation. We need to. Florida's ahead of us, for example. Some of the inefficiencies in our K-12 system need to be wrung out, but I don't think anybody thinks we overpay our teachers. So you need to figure out ways to get higher productivity in teaching and learning, and obviously there's agreement with the governor. We have to raise standards all over the educational system. Right now, though, I think the biggest danger for Minnesota on the educational side is a disinvestment in higher ed with rising tuition, making it less accessible to people. And secondly, our inability to prepare children to be ready to learn by the time they hit kindergarten and first grade. We have to do some investment there. The economic research is overwhelming. Those are the two areas I think we need to focus on.
So would you recommend then scaling back in other areas so that you could hold those harmless, if not actually increase
they cannot be held harmless. As we just saw, the governor made a budget reduction unilaterally that took $1.7 billion out of K-12 education. It's not possible to hold it harmless. The question is, can you tighten up expenditures at the same time you increase productivity and get better results? And to increase productivity, you're going to have to make some investments. And one of those investments is early childhood, and one of those investments is in higher ed. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get the productivity increases. It's a question of both spending reductions and investments, strategic investments, to get higher productivity.
So how much of this big picture is going to be reliant, completely dependent on the November forecast and the February forecast?
Well, what we were just talking about is mostly a long-term view of where we're at, and that's something that has to be addressed quickly. There's going to be a short-term budget problem, it appears, when the forecast comes out in about a month. And I don't know how bad that's going to be, but the unemployment rate has stubbornly stayed high, and the amount of revenue we're taking in at the state is slipping still. And so there'll probably be a short-term problem too. But I think we need to resolve the short-term problem, and we will. But more importantly is this long-term issue of increasing productivity and improving education. And we have to do something, otherwise we're going to just be on a continual spiral downwards like the state of California.
You mentioned the governor a few moments ago. You had breakfast with him on Tuesday morning. Is this a signal to you that he's engaged in the process?
Well, it was an excellent breakfast. Unclear. We reached out a hand of cooperation with him to say, let's attack this long-term budget problem. You know, leaving a problem of $5 to $7 billion at the end of your term is not a wise choice, we don't think. And we offered to help try to resolve that now. And I'm hopeful that he will accept that challenge and work with us to do that. And so I think it was a productive meeting in that sense. There was no denial that we have this problem, and so I think hopefully we'll work together on it.
So you have 2 meetings scheduled with this subcommittee before the end of the year. Do you hope to have some bills to present early in session?
We absolutely do. The House and Senate leadership has met. We're going to try to get a bonding bill and a job stimulus bill, as well as a cut bill put together, a spending reduction bill put together before session starts, so that we're ready to go. And then it would take the committees a couple weeks to process that, and we hopefully can have a relatively successful and speedy legislative session. And I think that's the goal, and I'm optimistic we can do that.
Okay, Senator Paul Miller, we'll follow it closely. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
If you think you have the flu but you're not sure, the Minnesota Department of Health has the answers and medical advice. It officially launched this toll-free number. Joining me right now, we have Senator David Senjem, the lone Republican on the subcommittee. Thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here.
I'm going to ask you the first question that I asked Senator Paul Miller. This is called the Big Picture Subcommittee. So as you sit on it, what do you see the vision? What's your vision for the big picture on how to create a sustainably balanced budget?
Well, my big picture is a growing and prosperous Minnesota, a Minnesota where there's hope, there's growth, there's opportunity, and there's a vision into the future that says that we can come out of this. We've got to do the right things, but we can come out of this and we can once again be the state that we all know and are proud of.
So what are some of the specific elements you would like to see included?
Well, I think it really gets to the whole issue of whether we live within our means or whether we attempt to tax ourselves out of this. Or perhaps a combination of both, but certainly from our perspective, we've got to live within our means. We're in a difficult time right now. There's no question about it. Families are very personally affected in many areas of our state and in great numbers, and we have to recognize that. And certainly business and business growth is going to be affected by any notion of increased taxes. So to the extent we can, I think we have to pull it in, so to speak, make these very difficult decisions and try to weather the storm and certainly move out of this.
So getting back to the idea of the big picture, right now there are a lot of different figures out there on what the budget deficit will be in 2011, 2012. We're hearing everything from $4 billion to $7 billion. Now the governor recently met with several DFL leaders at the governor's mansion, and he said, quote, "If you only spend what we are spending now, there is no deficit," referring to that next budget cycle. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, sure. I mean, if you live within your means, you live within your means.
Spending the same, if you spend the same. So you don't think that there will be an additional decrease in revenue?
Well, we'll have to see that. Certainly there are indications that it is, we're not living up, if you will, to our revenue forecast. On the other hand, by the numbers that we see, whether it's $150 million for the last biennium, or pardon me, the last year, going back to May, or whether it's this $52 million down in October, I mean, those numbers pale, at least by size. There's certainly a lot of money, but when we're talking about billions, I think we're pretty close to at least living within the forecasts right now, and minor tweaking can get us there. So again, I don't make any suggestion that this is going to be easy, but I think we have to recognize the fact that the only way out of this is to make those tough choices, to weather the storm, and to allow, most of all, job producers to continue to stay here, to invest here, to have confidence that their state is not going to tax them out of existence, and to grow wealth that way.
If there's a subcommittee that is devoted entirely to trying to fix the structural, repair the inequities in the revenue system, and the governor doesn't necessarily concur that there's a big problem, is this, in your opinion, an example of the vast differences in opinion, and can we have an effective 2010, 2011, 2012 cycle?
Well, I think I think we'll have an effective cycle, and I think there'll certainly be disagreements. And but I've also seen in the past where good people with a common objective can come together and make decisions. We did it in 2007 at the end of the session, 2008 at the end of the session. In 2009, we chose to go a different way in terms of transparency and a more public approach. That frankly didn't work very well. And I think if good people gather up in a room, talk through this, settle where they agree and where they don't disagree, and work on those disagreements, I think we can make this work.
So the fact that the governor did sit down with DFL leaders so early, does that signal to you that he is engaged in the process?
Oh, the governor's been engaged in the process, continually, as far as I'm concerned. I know personally that he's been working on his budget proposal most of the summer into the fall, and those ideas are evolve over time. And so the fact that he did meet with the DFL, I think, is a positive kind of outreach that I think is consistent with his view that we've got to get everybody on board and we have to have some agreement here, and we can go forward if we do.
What kind of bills do you think will come out of this subcommittee, and what can they do to be, as I said, effective in this big picture?
Well, I think the answer is I don't know what's going to come out of this subcommittee. In truth, however, what could hopefully come out of it would be a notion that to move out of this deficit, and it's not going to be easy, it's going to take a while. We need to create some investor confidence in Minnesota. We need to, in fact, look at where our tax rates are, where our regulatory climate is, and begin to assess that from the standpoint, is this the kind of state that people want to stay here and do business in, and grow, if you will, the new economy? I don't think it is right now. From every indication that I get, talking to people in that arena, they don't have a lot of interest right now in growing their businesses in Minnesota. And so they tend to move on to other states, in some cases even other countries. We've got to, in my view, reposition Minnesota into this competitive business environment that's going to grow wealth, and take ourselves out of this.
Are you suggesting cutting the corporate income tax rate?
Amongst other things, sure, yeah.
Some other
long look at that.
And I want to talk to you about a couple of the other ideas that were thrown out there recently at the meeting. Chair of the tax committee in the House, Ann Linchesky, thought that perhaps we could look into cutting tax expenditures. An idea at that recent leadership summit last month was to add a value-added tax comparable to what they have in Europe. Would your caucus support some ideas like this? At least consider them.
Well, sure, we'd consider those. We've talked consumption taxes versus income taxes. If we offset one with the other, I mean, what would the net result be? Can we take some pressure off job producers, the people that actually create the wealth, produce the jobs that in fact do stimulate our economy? What is the best route to do that? And it may in the end be more towards a consumption tax.
Bottom line, Senator Senjem, who do you think is going to be most affected as the legislature goes to try to balance the budget?
I think every aspect of government is going to have to be looked at. We do spend a lot, certainly in the Health and Human Services area. I just saw a recent report by the Census Bureau. We're third in the country in spending in that area. I think logically we'd be drawn to look there first. But beyond that, continue to look at other departments. I think we, to the extent possible, want to keep K-12 education as harmlessly hit as possible. Certainly want to take care of our nursing homes, but I think everything else is, if you will, on the table and subject to being looked at.
How specifically do you think mom and dad and the kids sitting around the kitchen table will be affected?
I think they're already being affected right now.
Will they be affected further?
If we don't do something positive in terms of creating wealth in this state, they certainly will be. Where does and I recently was back at my own college talking to seniors, and they're worried to death about whether they're going to graduate now. Where's our next job going to be? And it's not like it used to be. It's not that people descend on campus looking for new recruits, if you will. They have to go out and search very, very hard. So as we look to the future, we've just got to create a climate in Minnesota that's certainly conducive to job growth, and with that will come prosperity, and will prosperity will come all the good things we want.
And on that optimistic note, we are out of time. Senator Senjem, thanks for joining us.
Good. Thank you.
Joining me right now, the director of the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs. We have Dr. Larry Jacobs. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Let's talk a little bit about this subcommittee that was recently formed to try to balance the budget and look at things from a long-term standpoint. First of all, you understand the nuances of this legislature and the people on this subcommittee. What kind of recommendations do you think are going to come out of this?
Well, I take this to be a very serious initiative. I think there's a kind of come to Jesus moment that we've had at the Capitol since 2003. The Democrats and the Republicans have been on a roller coaster ride. This is not doing good for the Democratic Party, which is looking to establish its responsibility, its credibility in budget matters, and it's seen big cuts in the programs it cares about. Republicans, I think, are probably a little concerned that some of the programs that are dear to the hearts of voters may get blamed on them, particularly the ones that are getting cut as we move forward. So I think we've kind of hit the end of the road here. Plus you've got the stimulus money running out, and that is going to pull the rug out from both parties.
And so as they look to try to fix some of these structural inequities in our budget system and create a sustainable, balanced budget, what do you think some of those steps are that they may have to take, and what do you think this means?
Well, I think there are a number of different ideas that are floating around. I think the notion of a sustainable, balanced budget means different things to different people. I think for Republicans, they're focusing on whether the budget is sustainable and in terms of its solvency. We've got healthcare costs going up. We've got a number of other obligations going up at a time when the revenues are flat or going down. There's also real concern in both parties about the instability of the budget as it's kind of gone up and down this roller coaster. Then you get into issues of fairness that are usually of real concern to Democrats who are concerned about the more vulnerable parts of the population. And I think both parties have growing concern about economic growth. And how is it that you can invest in the state's future to ensure our competitiveness as a state in these dire fiscal times?
So, Dr. Jacobs, it has been said that this is as much, and you've just touched upon it a bit, this is as much of a political crisis as it is an economic crisis. Would you agree? And if so, what do you think should be done to try to bridge the crisis?
There's no doubt we are in a major political crisis. The parties are unable to work with each other. I think we need to be flat out about that. The governor and the legislature, controlled by different parties, are moving in opposite directions. And the result has been a series of car crashes. Now, have we been able to balance the budget? Well, kind of. Frankly, we're using a lot of budget gimmicks to hide a massive structural deficit that's going to be very large in the coming biennium as the stimulus money runs out. We've also, I think, have a major difference in terms of priorities about how we keep the economy growing while maintaining the key priorities here in the state in terms of education and some other areas that are necessary. So I think this is very much a political crisis, and the question is, can the two parties agree on at least a common set of objectives in terms of the level of taxation and where to spend the money and what kind of results to expect?
And you just read my mind. That was my last question. Do you think that my next question, do you think they're going to be able to come together and find some areas of common resolution?
I would say if you've been a close observer of the legislature over the last 5 or 6 years, it's hard to be terribly hopeful.
But isn't it a different time? Would you concur that it is a different time and perhaps people will come to the table where they haven't before?
I don't think the Democratic and Republican parties have an option, particularly when you look at the stimulus money drying up and the fact that the legislature and the governor have been using these budget gimmicks to hide a massive structural deficit. There really is no place to hide. So both parties are going to have to come together, and there's going to have to be some, I think, meeting of the minds about the level of taxation. Some areas are probably going to have to be an increase in taxation. There have to be some other areas we're probably going to have to look hard at various kinds of tax deductions and incentives to help grow our economy, particularly in the more dynamic areas. Then on the spending side, clearly education is the future of the state. Healthcare costs, it's a national story, but here in Minnesota, we are also seeing rising healthcare costs eating away at our precious reserves. So this is nowhere else for the Democrats and Republicans to run. They're either going to solve this, or frankly, the future in Minnesota is really not a bright one.
Yeah, one of your areas of expertise is political history. In your opinion, is history going to be made in the next year or two? And is this subcommittee, in effect, making history? Is it crafting history?
Well, I think the key question about the subcommittee is whether it really is going to be an area for compromise and coming together on an agenda, or if it's for show. And I don't think we're going to know the answer to that question for a couple years. We've got a governor who's on his way out. We've got a gubernatorial race that is clearly heating up, and this is going to play into that. So I don't think we're necessarily going to see the answer to whether this is the real deal or just another one of these commissions or subcommittees. That doesn't really lead to much. We're not going to know that in the coming session, but I think we will know within 2 years. This is akin to, I think, the mid-1970s, when Minnesota made some very dramatic bipartisan decisions about the bottom line priorities. Each party gave up a bit in order to serve the greater good in Minnesota. Question is, can the parties do that? Both parties are being pulled in opposite directions. The conservative rank and file have tremendous sway on the Republican Party and the gubernatorial nomination process. The liberals have a strong pull on the Democratic Party and who they're going to nominate for governor. That is not a propitious set of circumstances for this kind of broad consensus.
I have 2 questions left, and I want to get to both of them in a very short period of time. So during a recent leadership summit, Governor Carlson brought up a suggestion that he thinks each caucus, all four of them, should craft their own plans on how to balance the budget and what the spending priorities are. Then he also thought the governor should as well, and they should market those to the people. Do you think that this is a valid idea? And is it a realistic idea?
Well, Governor Carlson's always very bright and innovative. I don't think that's going to be realistic given the timeline and also the need to bring people together. We've really got a disconnect between a public who wants our political leaders to come forward with a responsible plan and the leadership in our capital that's really been at odds and unable to work together.
You brought up a little bit earlier the governor, and he did meet with DFL leaders earlier in the week for breakfast. Do you think this signals to people that he's engaged in the process?
Absolutely, and this is a good sign to see the governor and legislative leaders getting together. To be honest, I'd be surprised if this is much more than try to get a lot of work done early on. I don't think this is going to be a short session, of course, and it's usually a bonding year. But I think the governor and the legislature are probably putting together a small number of high-priority items that they can agree on and move quickly to achieve something. With the realization that with the gubernatorial race, with this governor as a lame duck governor, there's not a whole lot that's going to get done.
All right, Dr. Jacobs, we're out of time. Thank you for your time, though.
Good to be with you.
And that wraps up this week's show. From all of us here at Senate Media Services, I'm Julie Barkey. Thanks for watching Capitol Report.